At 12:30 p.m. on November 24, 1944, Staff Sergeant Arthur Billings sat in the rear plexiglass blister of a B-29 Superfortress named Dauntless Doi, watching a swarm of Japanese Ki-44 Tojo fighters climbing vertically to kill him. He was 30,000 feet above Tokyo, an altitude where the air is so thin that a human being will pass out in 45 seconds without oxygen. Outside the glass, the temperature was 50 degrees below zero. Inside, Billings sat in a padded chair, wearing a light flight suit, sweating from the sheer tension of the moment. He wasn't freezing. He wasn't wrestling a heavy machine gun against a 300-mile-per-hour slipstream. He was sitting in a warm, pressurized cabin that felt more like a dentist's office than a battlefield. And that comfort was terrifying. Felt fake. To a gunner who had cut his teeth on the B-17, where the wind screamed through open hatches and hot brass casings burned your neck, this silent, hermetically sealed bubble didn't feel safe. It felt like a coffin waiting to be cracked open. To understand why the gunners of the 20th Air Force were afraid of their own airplane, you have to understand the engineering nightmare of the B-29. It was the most advanced machine of the war, a shiny silver beast that cost $3 billion to develop, more than the atomic bomb project. It was designed to fly higher and faster than any bomber in history. But that height created a deadly problem. 30,000 feet, you can't breathe. The designers couldn't just give the crew oxygen masks and open the windows. At that altitude, the cold would freeze the hydraulic lines and the men. So they pressurized the entire fuselage. They pumped air into the cabin to simulate an altitude of 8,000 feet. They turned the plane into a flying Coca-Cola bottle. This created a submarine trap. A submarine is safe as long as the hull is intact, but punch a hole in it and the pressure blows out as the ocean rushes in. In a B-29, if you cut a hole in the fuselage to stick a machine gun barrel outside, all the air would rush out. The crew would get the bends, pass out, and die. You couldn't have open gun ports. You couldn't have ball turrets spinning with men inside them, breaking the pressure seal. The plane had to be a smooth, unbroken tube of aluminum. But a bomber without guns is just a target. The engineers were stuck. They had built a plane that could reach Japan, but they couldn't figure out how to defend it once it got there. The Japanese pilots understood this immediately. When the first B-29s appeared over the Pacific, the enemy treated them like whales. They knew American crews were hiding inside pressurized shells. They attacked from steep angles, diving out of the sun, or climbed from below to slash at the soft belly of the giant. They knew that if they could crack the glass, the Superfortress would lose pressure and be forced down to lower altitudes where anti-aircraft guns could tear it apart. The early missions were disasters. The defensive systems were clumsy. The gunners felt helpless, trapped behind double-paned glass, watching enemy fighters dart around them like sharks circling a bathysphere. Then General Electric proposed a solution that sounded like science fiction. They called it central fire control. It was a radical idea that took the gun out of the gunner's hands. Instead of standing behind a .50 caliber machine gun, bracing against recoil and aiming down a steel barrel, the gunner would sit at a remote station. He would look through a sighting device that resembled precision binoculars. 40 feet away, outside the pressurized cabin, a robotic turret would wake up. The gunner would move a dial, and a computer, not digital silicon but a mechanical brain of gears, cams, and mirrors, would calculate where the gun needed to point. It would send electrical signals to motors in the turret. The turret would rotate, elevate, and fire. The gunner would never touch the weapon. He would never feel the vibration. He would press a button on a plastic handle, and a plane half a mile away would explode. It was the birth of video game warfare decades before video games existed. The veteran gunners hated it. They mocked the sighting stations with their tiny knobs and glass reticles and called them Buck Rogers toys. They called the system the robot. To men who had survived the slaughter of Europe, trusting their lives to a box of wires felt obscene. They trusted grease. They trusted steel. They trusted muscle connected directly to metal. If a gun jammed on a B-17, you kicked it, racked the bolt, poured oil on it, and fixed it. You couldn't fix the robot. If central fire control failed, you were helpless. The gunners imagined watching a zero charge straight at them while they twisted a dead dial connected to nothing. They said engine vibration would shake vacuum tubes loose. They said the cold would freeze the grease in the gears. They laughed at the General Electric engineers in white lab coats who had never fired a shot in anger. They called the B-29 the glitch, convinced the first real dogfight would blow a fuse and kill them all. But the mockery was also about pride. There was masculinity in being an aerial gunner. You were the sheepdog guarding the flock. You walked off the plane smelling of cordite and sweat, shoulders bruised from recoil. Central Fire Control turned the gunner into an accountant. He sat in a chair and adjusted knobs. He didn't even have to lead the target. The machine did the math. Felt cowardly. Felt like cheating. Pilots joked the gunners were passengers now, riding in the back and playing with magic lanterns while the real men flew the airplane. But the black box didn't care. Inside the fuselage sat a dense block of machinery the size of a bread box. Inside it was a masterpiece of analog engineering, a physical model of flight itself. It knew the bomber's airspeed, altitude, and temperature. When the gunner tracked a Japanese fighter, the computer instantly calculated parallax, bullet drop, and wind drift from 400 miles per hour of rushing air. A human gunner guesses. The machine does not. He has to guess how much the bullet will slow down. He has to guess the wind. He is doing calculus in his head while terrified. The human brain is good, but it is not fast enough. The robot was faster. It adjusted the guns continuously, tracking the target with a smoothness no human hand could match. It did not flinch. It did not get scared. It simply pointed the barrels at the exact point in space where the enemy was going to die. On that November afternoon over Tokyo, the joking stopped. The swarm of Toyos was not theoretical. They were real and they were hungry. The lead Japanese pilot saw the big silver bomber and thought he was looking at an easy kill. He saw no open gun ports. He saw no muzzle flashes. He saw a fat, defenseless whale floating in the blue sky. He pulled back on the stick and rocketed up from below, aiming for the glass nose of the giant. Inside Dauntless Doi, Sergeant Billings watched the fighter grow larger in his sight. His hands sweated on the plastic grips. Every instinct screamed at him to lead the target, to swing the sight ahead of the enemy plane. But the training manual said no. The manual said, put the dot on the bandit. Felt wrong. Felt like suicide. If he aimed directly at the plane, the bullets should have fallen behind it. Every fiber of his being told him the machine would miss. He had a split second to decide. Trust his gut or trust the glitch. He could override the system and guess the lead like in the old days, or he could surrender control to the gears and wires humming beneath his feet. The Tojo was closing fast, its cannons flashing. Billings took a breath of recycled, pressurized air. He clamped his hand on the dead man's switch. He put the glowing orange reticle directly on the cockpit of the Japanese fighter and pressed the trigger. When Staff Sergeant Billings fired inside the pressurized bubble of Dauntless Doi, he braced for violence. In AB-17, firing twin .50 caliber guns was a physical fight. The floor shook. The smell of burning powder filled your nose. The noise was deafening, a jackhammer pounding your skull. But in the B-29, when Billings squeezed the plastic switch, nothing happened. There was no recoil. There was no smell. There was only a polite hum from electrical relays. It felt like pressing a radio button, not firing a weapon of war. 40 feet away on top of the silver fuselage, the upper forward turret woke up with a violence Billings could not feel. Electric motors, driven by calculations from the General Electric computer, spun the heavy turret instantly. The machine gun barrels did not point where Billings was looking. They pointed where the enemy was going to be. The robot sensed the fighter's speed. It measured bullet drop. It factored in the 400-mile-per-hour wind tearing across the nose. All in the fraction of a second it took the signal to travel down a wire. The result was terrifyingly efficient. The stream of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds did not spray like a garden hose. It flew as a tight, rigid rope of fire. The Japanese pilot, climbing vertically toward the bomber's nose, never had a chance to react. He was used to American gunners who tracked slowly, men wrestling iron sights against the wind. He expected tracers to drift wide. Instead, he flew face-first into a solid wall of lead. Billings watched through the plexiglass as the Tojo simply disintegrated. One moment it was a sleek metal shark screaming upward. The next it was a fireball tumbling backward. The wings sheared off. The engine block, smashed by heavy slugs, smoked and died. It happened so fast Billings did not even feel relief. He stared at the empty sky where the fighter had been. The glitch had not glitched. The Buck Rogers toy had just swatted a 30,000 horsepower fighter out of the air without breaking a sweat. To understand why this was a miracle, you have to look inside the little black box the veteran gunners mocked. It was not a computer as we think of them today. There were no silicon chips and no code. It was a mechanical brain. Inside the metal casing was a dense forest of gears, cams, and mirrors, like a Swiss watch exploded. When the gunner moved his sight, he was not moving a cursor. He was turning a shaft that spun a gear, pushed a cam, and shifted a mirror. It was an analog computer-solving calculus with geometry. If the gunner tilted his sight upward, a gear spun to represent elevation. If the plane banked, a gyroscope tilted, pushing a lever to represent gravity. The machine physically combined these forces. It was a player piano that played bullets instead of music. General Electric engineers had turned the chaos of aerial combat into a math problem solved by spinning metal wheels. The most magical part was how it solved the cross-eyed problem. In a normal plane, the gunner stands behind the gun and looks down the barrel. What he sees is what he hits. In a B-29, the gunner might be in the nose while the gun sat 40 feet back on top of the fuselage. At 500 yards, that offset created parallax. If uncorrected, the gunner and gun would be cross-eyed, and the bullets would miss by dozens of feet. The General Electric computer fixed this automatically. It knew the exact distance between sight and gun. As the target moved closer or farther away, gears whispered commands to the turret to tilt or straighten. It triangulated the kill shot continuously, adjusting angles so the gunner's line of sight and the bullet stream met at the enemy aircraft. It did this while the target moved at 300 miles per hour and the bomber bucked through turbulence. As the battle over Tokyo raged, the crew of Dauntless Doi realized the robot was not just working. It was doing what no human could. The B-29 carried 5 turrets but only 4 gunners plus a bombardier. There were more guns than men. In older bombers, that meant dead weight. Central Fire Control changed that with a trick called handover. Each gunner had a panel of switches and lights. If a fighter attacked from the nose and then peeled off along the side, the nose gunner could track it until it left his view, then flip a switch and hand control to the side gunner. The guns snapped instantly to the new sight. One man could control 1 turret, 2, or even 3 at once. If a gunner was wounded or overwhelmed, another could assume control in seconds. The bomber became a porcupine that shifted its quills toward danger. Japanese pilots were baffled. They were used to finding blind spots. On AB-17, certain angles were safe because guns physically could not reach them. On AB-29, the blind spots moved. A pilot diving on the tail would suddenly see a forward turret spin 180 degrees and fire backward. The robot did not care where the guns pointed. It only cared about the target. The airplane felt alive, as if it were watching them. By the time Dauntless Doi turned back toward the Marianas, the mockery was gone. The gunners sat in their padded chairs, rubbing their eyes, not from wind or cold, but from the strain of staring into the sights. They hadn't fired a single shot with their hands. They hadn't touched a charging handle. They hadn't cleared a jam. The computers had done the heavy lifting. The floor around the remote turrets was covered in a carpet of spent brass casings ejected automatically by the guns. But the success of the system created a new problem: escalation. The Japanese were losing pilots at a catastrophic rate, but they were learning. They realized that the B-29 wasn't a soft whale. It was a flying battleship. They couldn't just slash at it with machine guns anymore. The robot was too fast. It swatted them down before they could get close enough to puncture the pressurized hull. So the enemy changed tactics. If they couldn't get close to the B-29s, they would have to hit them from somewhere the computers couldn't reach. They started moving their heavy anti-aircraft flak batteries. They concentrated them around the cities, creating walls of exploding steel that no computer could dodge. You can't shoot a flak shell with a machine gun. The robot could kill a fighter, but it couldn't kill a cloud of shrapnel. And then came the Tayatari tactics, the body crash. Japanese pilots, realizing they couldn't outshoot the American computers, began to consider the ultimate counter-move. If you can't shoot the bomber down, become the bullet. They stripped the armor off their fighters to make them faster. They climbed higher, waiting for the B-29s to enter the bomb run, where they had to fly straight and level. On a mission just a few weeks later, the crew of a B-29 looked out through their blisters and saw something that chilled their blood. It wasn't a fighter trying to dogfight. It was a twin-engine Nick flying straight at them, not firing its guns. The pilot wasn't trying to aim. He was staring straight ahead, throttle pushed to the firewall, aiming his propellers at their wing. The central fire control system was a miracle of engineering, but it was built to track targets that behaved like rational pilots. It calculated lead based on the idea that the enemy wanted to survive. It wasn't programmed for a man who wanted to die. The gunners swung their sights. The gears in the black boxes spun frantically, trying to solve a collision course. The robot hummed, pushing the turrets to their stops. The Japanese plane grew larger in the glass, a screaming metal missile that didn't care about math. The gunner squeezed the trigger. The turrets roared. Tracers hammered the oncoming plane. Pieces flew off, canopy glass and wing tips shredding away. But the plane kept coming. It was a dead machine flown by a dead man, guided by momentum alone. The robot could kill the pilot, but it couldn't stop the physics of a 2-ton object hurling through the sky at 400 miles per hour. The crew braced for impact. The video game war was over. The fistfight was about to begin. By January of 1945, the war over Japan had changed. The B-29 gunners were no longer terrified rookies staring through plexiglass blisters, waiting for the robot to fail. They were believers. They had seen the General Electric computers swat fighters out of the sky with precision that felt supernatural. But the Japanese were adapting. They realized the B-29 was a hard target, a flying porcupine that could track them through clouds, darkness, and violent evasive maneuvers. So they stopped trying to dogfight. They started trying to collide. The body crash tactics known as Tayatari were a nightmare for central fire control. The computer was designed to calculate lead angles for a plane that wanted to shoot and survive. It wasn't designed for a plane that wanted to die. When a Japanese fighter committed to a ramming attack, it didn't bank or turn. It flew in a straight, screaming line. Closing speeds were insane, often over 600 miles per hour combined. At that speed, the computer had milliseconds to solve the geometry. On a mission over Nagoya, a B-29 named Stockett's rocket found itself in the crosshairs of this new madness. A twin-engine Nick appeared at the 12 o'clock position. It wasn't maneuvering. It was coming head-on, propellers a blur, aiming directly for the cockpit glass. The bombardier in the nose, sitting directly in the path of the oncoming missile, grabbed his sight. He didn't have to shout orders to a gunner in the back. He just flipped a switch. This was the handover system at its most critical. In a split second, the bombardier took control of both the upper forward and lower forward turrets. He became a one-man army. He swung the sight onto the nose of the suicide plane. The computer inside the black box sensed the incredible rate of closure. The gears spun so fast they hummed, tilting the .50 caliber machine guns almost to their mechanical limits. The bombardier pressed the trigger. A wall of fire erupted from the front of the B-29. It wasn't a few bullets. It was a deluge, for guns pumping out 50 rounds per second. The stream of lead met the Japanese fighter 1,000 yards out. It didn't just punch holes. It shredded it like a cheese grater. The cockpit disintegrated. The pilot was killed instantly, but the plane kept coming, driven by momentum. This was the moment the robot proved its true worth. A human gunner would have flinched. He would have seen the massive metal object rushing at his face and ducked. The computer didn't flinch. It kept the guns locked on center mass, pouring fire into the wing root until the structural spars snapped. One wing folded upward. The dead plane rolled violently to the right, missing the B-29's wingtip by less than 20 feet. The backwash rocked the bomber like a boat in a hurricane, but it was safe. The crew exhaled a breath they had been holding for 10 seconds. The machine had stared down death and didn't blink. But the real test of the system wasn't just defending a single plane. It was defending the formation. The B-29s flew in loose streams, not tight wingtip-to-wingtip boxes like in Europe. That meant a single bomber often had to cover its neighbor. The central fire control system was perfect for this because the turrets were remote and the gunners had massive fields of view. They could see threats attacking planes nearby. On one legendary mission, a B-29 gunner named Sergeant Red Miller saw a Zero dropping onto the tail of a bomber flying 500 yards to his right. The gunner on that plane was looking the other way. Miller didn't get on the radio. He didn't waste time. He just swung his sight. His computer calculated the range not just to the enemy, but to a point in space where the enemy would be relative to his own aircraft. It was a trigonometry nightmare. They replaced the mechanical cams with software code, but the concept remained exactly the same. A remote operator, a calculating brain, and a gun that aimed itself. If you look at a modern Navy destroyer today, you will see a white domed robot sitting on the deck. It looks like our 2D2 with a Gatling gun. It is called the Phalanx CIWS. It shoots down incoming missiles automatically. It calculates wind, gravity, and speed in a fraction of a second, just like the B-29 system did. When a pilot in an Apache helicopter looks at a target and the gun under the nose swivels to follow his eye, that is the great-grandchild of the B-29 turret. The video game War Sergeant Billings fought over Tokyo is now the standard way the world fights. The drone operators sitting in trailers in Nevada, flying aircraft on the other side of the world, are the direct descendants of the gunners sitting in blister seats, controlling turrets 40 feet away. The legacy of the robot is also written in the lives of the men it saved. There are thousands of grandfathers who came home from the Pacific because the computer did not miss. They went back to jobs at gas stations and factories. They raised families. They did not talk much about the war, and when they did, they rarely talked about the black box. It is hard to tell a heroic war story about a computer. It is more dramatic to talk about wrestling a stick or fighting a fire. Aiming a remote turret feels cold. It lacks the sweat and grit of the infantry. So the story of the central fire control system faded into the background. It became a footnote in technical manuals known only to aviation mechanics and historians. But the gunners knew. They remembered the feel of the dead man's switch in their hands. They remembered the eerie smoothness of the turret spinning to track a fighter they had not fully recognized yet. They remembered the moment of trust when they chose to let the machine do the work. It was a strange relationship, a man entrusting his life to a box of gears. In a war defined by brute force and raw courage, the B-29 gunners were the first to step into the future. They were the first generation to fight a push-button war. They proved you did not have to be a muscle-bound warrior to kill the enemy. You just had to be calm enough to trust the math. Today, only a few B-29s remain in the world. Most sit in museums, polished and silent. If you walk through the fuselage of one, you can still see the sighting stations. They look archaic now, like old radios from the 1940s. The plastic knobs are yellowed with age. The glass sights are dusty. The little black boxes are hidden behind panels. They're grease-dried, their gears frozen in time. Visitors walk past them without realizing what they are seeing. They see a bomber and think of pilots or atomic bombs. They do not realize they are looking at the great-grandfather of the modern combat computer. The story of the glass bubble executioner is a reminder that innovation is often mocked before it is understood. The experts laughed at the robot. They called it a toy. They said it would fail. But when the metal was flying and the chips were down, the toy was the only thing standing between the crew and death. It reminds us that the greatest advantage in war is not always the biggest gun or the fastest plane. Sometimes it is the smartest brain. The engineers at General Electric, working with slide rules and pencils, built a machine that could outthink a samurai warrior in the sky. We tell these stories so the genius of the central fire control system does not vanish into silence. We tell them to honor the unsung mechanics and engineers who shaped victory. We tell them to honor gunners like Sergeant Billings, who sat in plastic bubbles at 30,000 feet, fighting cold and fear, trusting a mechanical brain to bring them home. They were pioneers of a new age, the first men to fight with a joystick instead of a trigger. If the story of the glitch that cleared the skies over Tokyo moved you, hit the like button. It helps fight the algorithm and keeps these mechanical histories alive. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the machines that won the war. We dig through blueprints every week to uncover the hardware and the heroes that changed the world. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. We want to hear from aviation geeks in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and everywhere else. Tell us if you have ever seen a B-29 up close. Did you notice the turrets? Did you know they were robots? Share your story. You are the keepers of this history as much as we are. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the Superfortress is never forgotten.